Welcome to the Nomad Futurist podcast, where ideas shape the future and visionaries redefine what's possible. Join us as we dive deep into the evolution of technology, society, and human potential, spotlighting the voices driving change and reimagining our world. Connect with us and join us at media.nomadfuturist.org. The future is a story we write together. Let's kick it off. Here are your hosts, Phil and Nabeel. Hello. Welcome to Nomad Futurist. This is your co-host, Nabeel Mahmood, calling in from Waikoloa, Hawaii.
This is your co-host, Phillip Koblence from Montclair, New Jersey.
And Kemal Hawa, I'm in Washington, D.C.
Kemal, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It seems like that we've had a plethora of attorneys and legal counsel on the platform lately, particularly this year. So welcome.
Well, we've tried the rest. Now we are going to get the best.
There you have it. Yep, that's the line. Well, actually, it was his schedule that kept us waiting.
That's
but
how
here
you know.
we are.
Best are the busiest.
Exactly. So, Kemal, could you share with our audience at a very high level who you are and what are you up to these days?
Sure. I'm a partner at Kirkland Ellis, and it almost exclusively focuses on the digital infrastructure space, all asset classes, best known for data centers, but data centers, terrestrial fiber, submarine cables, towers, GPUs, and just about the entire communications ecosystem.
Brilliant. It's certainly very interesting. Over the last few years, legal has become a major part of what we do. You have a very interesting background, and that's one of the things that we would love to share with our audience over here. So for starters, I see that you went to college to be a lawyer. What we would like to know, what was that driving force behind that? Did you grow up with a bunch of attorneys in your family? Were you the one and exclusive black sheep in the family that wanted to practice law? Or was that influenced by school and or other environments around you?
I'm definitely not surrounded by attorneys in my family. I was the first, at least in my immediate family. I was young and idealistic, and not to mention you watch a lot of courtroom dramas, and I had an affinity for it and a sense of getting out there and pursuing justice. I originally wanted to be a litigator, but found out that transactions was more suited for my skill set.
So was there a particular field or subject matter expertise that you were pursuing when you did decide to pursue law as your career pathway?
I didn't have a specific field in mind, and that might be something to talk about because I know this is geared towards aspiring lawyers and young people. But no, I went where the opportunity was. I graduated from law school in 1996, and it just so happened that the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was, passed in 1996. And it fundamentally overhauled the U.S. communications legal system. And that's where the opportunities was. That was what was really booming. And I actually had spent a couple of years during law school, an internship or two in the field. So I had a little bit of familiarity with the space. So it was really serendipitous. It's just that was what was really happening at the time. That had a good knack for it as well.
I just have to ask one question before I forget. What was your favorite courtroom drama? What was the impetus for you to become a lawyer? Is it Matlock? I'm trying to think. Who did Kemal Hawa mimic himself after?
I'm going to go with the classics here because it's actually true. I would say To Kill a Mockingbird and Darrow with Inherit the Wind.
So when you were at Georgetown, you got a bachelor's before you decided to pursue law, your JD. What were your subject? What was your major? What were you going after back then?
Political science at Georgetown. So it's a very common major for aspiring law students. It's a very common major because it's a good general degree. You can do a lot of different things with degrees. So it gives you the flexibility.
So being in DC and going political science, was politics actually ever even on the radar?
No, not for me. But I think, like you said, being in DC, it's always sort of a mix of politics and the economy and government and markets.
Did you grow up in DC?
I grew up in DC, yeah.
What did your parents do since you're the first lawyer of the family? What was the young Kemal Hawa's influences?
Yeah. My father, he was a small restaurant owner, more like diners, and my mother worked as an administrator in the local school system.
How about your siblings? What are they up to? Or what career pathways did they take?
A variety. One's a teacher, one's a chiropractor, and one works as a senior manager with one of a large company.
So this is so funny, Phil. It feels like Dr. Judy or whatever the TV series is.
Judge
Yes.
Dr. Phil, Judge Judy.
All right. So you found your niche, and the telecommunication after 1996 sounds like that was one of the core drivers behind you getting into the data center sector. So could you share that journey as to how you got to where you're at today?
Yeah, sure. Basically, my career has followed the trajectory of the industry itself. Sort of in 1996, there was a lot of local competition issues in the telecommunications sector between what were competitive local exchange carriers and incumbent local exchange carriers. That then morphed immediately into, with the advent and proliferation of the internet in the mid to late 90s is when the technology really began to get rolled out as a mass market technology. The internet became interwoven with telecommunications. There was a whole series of issues there. At the same time, the wireless industry was also emerging, and next generation wireless technology with 3G, 4G, 5G. So there was just this mass rollout of new technologies in the mid to late 90s into the 2000 tech boom. And then that pivoted towards the rise of the data center industry as a standalone business model. And so data centers have been a part of the communications network in some way, shape, or form from the beginning. That's just the data centers. We used to have trouble defining what a data center is because it's basically where content is stored. And data center now is almost synonymous with a massive facility, but that was not the case then. It was a telco closet down the hall was a data center, a small infrastructure facility in the basement was a data center. And then as content and bandwidth intensive applications grew, the data centers grew, became sort of its own business, and it grew right out of the telecommunications and internet. And so it was just a logical next step. And the practitioners who have been in the space from the beginning, they can bring a unique perspective because it's all basically part and parcel with the same thing.
As you can tell, Kemal and I have earned our hairlines by being in the data center industry since 1996. I think when people think of lawyers, they think of people that are well-versed in all of kind of legal precedents and contracts law and tort and all of the things that you see on TV shows and think of legal libraries and law schools. There's an element to this, just the way you're describing it, that suggests an underlying interest in the technology of it. And I think you can't really separate the two, right? In order to do what you do well, the law part is important, but it's really more of a facilitator of the technical elements of it. Did you grow up appreciating technology? Were you into technology? What do you recall as being like that immediate kind of aha moment when you discovered that communications was the area in which you wanted to focus your kind of legal acumen?
Well, you touched on a couple of things there. The first part was how industry expertise feeds into the practice of law. And I think at this point, it's indispensable. And what's funny, it didn't used to always be that way. In certain parts of the world, you still have legal generalists. In fact, I've said that in the U.S., I've been practicing law 30 years. And at the beginning of my career, there was a thing that you were kind of just a lawyer and a host of issues would come your way. And you had good relationships, you had clients, and you hit the library and your team knew what you had to do to learn an issue. I would say largely, at least with respect to this industry, that doesn't exist anymore. You have to have a fundamental understanding of the technology. You have to have a fundamental understanding of the competitive landscape. You have to understand the client business and the challenges and risks that they face. Otherwise, give them a contract, it's just words on a piece of paper. And without the visibility into the nuance and complexities of those words, you can't perform at the highest level. So I would say that the U.S. legal industry has definitely strongly pivoted towards specialization. And I would say Europe is heading that direction increasingly as well, although not quite to the extent of the U.S. just yet. But I would say within the next decade, Europe will be in a similar position where when you're doing a healthcare deal, you're hiring a healthcare M&A lawyer. When you're doing a digital infrastructure deal, you're hiring a digital infrastructure M&A lawyer. And I just think that's probably the way the legal market will go.
Let the record show that Kemal Hawa suggested that contracts are just words on a piece of paper.
Well, that's right.
I've always wanted to say that.
If you were to put a timestamp to it, like we move from the IDFs and MDFs to being the core of the data infrastructure, we move from talking about CDNs to data centers. If you were to put a timestamp where regulation, compliance, and the legal elements started becoming critical and coming to the forefront, what would that be? It would be 2005, 2007, 2010 as a sector in law?
I would say it will be closer to 2005, but what you saw happening, there was a lot of different things happening. The first is, in probably the primary driver, like I said, we saw these bandwidth intensive applications. You had the rollout of the next generation of wireless technologies, the streaming video, social media, proliferation of content and bandwidth intensive applications. So then what you saw really two things happen, and really it's just 1A and 1B. The first is enterprises, large to mid-sized enterprises, used to manage their own IT. They would have their own IT infrastructure, and it was manageable with a small to medium-sized IT division. That what you found is as IT grew and grew and grew, it became a core part of a company's operations. Now, some companies continued to manage that and continued to build their own IT infrastructure, but you saw increasingly this migration. We said, listen, our core business is X, it's not IT, so we're going to outsource that to the professionals, the data center operators who do it. And that migration has been pretty steadfast over the last decade. And it used to be a question, you see 20%, 30%, I think 70, 80% of enterprise IT infrastructure is now outsourced to the cloud. The related thing, going back to 1996, prior to that, really prior to 1984, when it was one company essentially, you start to see the Telecommunications Act and other laws foster competition. So there became a thing. It used to be, it was one thing, and then there became a thing, a tower company. And then data centers sort of became a standalone business model. Nobody knew where it was going at the time. And there became a thing called fiber companies. It wasn't all the traditional classic telcos anymore. And the data center, with the more bandwidth intensive applications, got bigger and bigger and bigger. Now it is the sections of things.
So looking back on it in hindsight, you can see all these things, but when you're living it in the moment, it's really difficult to see kind of the forest for the trees. When you started your legal career in line with basically the Telecommunications Act of 1996, in line with when Phillip Koblence started NYI with his brother in 1996. So we started at the same time. At the end of that 4-year period was this bubble that had burst, like the initial internet bubble. Where were you at that point? And did you think like you needed to pivot away from telecommunications and digital infrastructure, or did you see it as a potential for life beyond that present moment?
No, it's a great question. And I have to say, over the last 30 years, we've seen some tough times in the industry and when the tech bubble burst. And I would say for a good portion of the 2000s, the industry was, other than maybe the wireless portion of the industry was steady, but not in a state of dramatic growth for nearly a decade. And there are times during the course of that decade when you're watching other segments of the economy that are booming and your segment is not booming, where you question some of your decisions and wonder whether or not you need to pivot. But there's also an incredible advantage to having a historical perspective in long term. There's a very strong competitive advantage to having been in the industry from the beginning. And when it came back, it really was quite rewarding. It was like, look, I invested the majority of my professional career in this segment of the economy, and now it is the centerpiece of the global economy.
Were there points there where associates in firms that you were in or in your personal life were like, really, you need to start focusing on real estate law, or you need to start focusing on these other areas of law? And you specifically like said, no, I'm all in on telecommunications. I'm all in on digital infrastructure. This is going to come back.
Well, so I would say no to the core question of whether there was a meaningful push from third parties to redirect. The thing is, there are some segments of the economy. I always pick three. This is sort of just me, but it's sort of like when, even during when there was a tech bubble bust, and then there was sort of a decade of just steady performance of the industry, but not prolific growth. It's like digital infrastructure isn't going anywhere. The three segments of the economy, even then, there was nobody that would say 50 years from now, we're going to need less digital infrastructure, but we're going to need less energy, but we're going to need less healthcare infrastructure. I always pick those three segments of the economy because, by the way, there's been times where the energy industry is putzing along. There's been time when the healthcare industry has been putzing along. But still, you can look at it and say, 50 years from now, we're just going to need more of every one of those three, even though to a near certainty, they're going to be tough times being alley within the next 50 years.
So if you were to look back in history, you've gone through literally the entire cycle of the data infrastructure, right? 90s is really when we came to birth as a sector. Nobody knew what we did prior to that. Computing became normalized over the last 3 decades or so, give or take. So if you've seen the peaks and valleys, you've seen centralized, decentralized computing, moving to cloud, colo, so on and so forth. In your current engagements, or as you advise with acquisitions or where the next data center build out needs to be, what are you seeing in conversations that you're having? Is there topics and discussions around the fact that we're going to go back in time, how we were a decade ago, whereby are we going to bring in mission critical application back into the enterprise space versus moving them in colo or staying in cloud environment or shared resource? Because now the equation is getting complicated, right? With GDPR, data regulation, data compliance, data sovereignty, so on and so forth, multitude of issues that are coming to the forefront that did not exist 5 years ago.
Well, as to the core of your question, in some version of that question, I get a lot in the form of why doesn't more companies do this for themselves, whether it be cloud providers building their own data centers or enterprise customers manage their IT. And the answer really just comes down to, first, it's not their core business. What's the flip side of that same coin is there are organizations, data center operators, in the case of data centers, tower companies, data towers that are devoted to that segment of the economy. They're professionals. That's what they do for a living. They have the personnel and expertise to focus on that. So why not outsource that critical input to the companies that do that for a living? So I don't see that changing. The second part of what you talked about is a really interesting question, as we're seeing a lot of shifts, not just due to regulation like GDPR and privacy and data security regulations, but also probably the single biggest factor, global power constraints, where we've been seeing the trend has been towards massive scale data center facilities. And Europe is a good example for GDPR because first, there's really not too many locations in Europe that can accommodate a gigawatt data center. And so that's one. The second is there are numerous smaller countries with their own legal regimes and legal systems. And that's where the privacy data security regulations come in, and the content needs to reside at home. So I think there will be a trend, particularly in Europe, towards smaller, more in-country data centers for those reasons.
So with data moving out, right, I think we've had some major events that have happened since 2020. For instance, the SolarWinds fallout, the Log4Shell vulnerability. You had the Move It transfer breach, the Microsoft Exchange online compromise, where when we outsourced all the emails, the Colonial Pipe attack, the Ukraine cyber warfare, MGM, for instance, them losing all critical data. In your engagements, is that even a topic of discussion whereby we want to bring those environments back in and manage it ourselves? The challenge or the question that I'm trying to lead into is the fact is, whilst outsourcing is cost effective and it makes sense, we've gone through the cycle of centralized and decentralized computing, ownership of data, movement, migration of the data. Good, it works. But we're losing control, right? And it's the silence behind the blue that's been practiced. So are we putting enough legal framework that once there are these breaches that happen, that the end users are protected, the owner of the data is protected, and the service providers are protected, and we are being fully transparent? Because we have done, as a sector, a pretty good job in hiding and not sharing the root cause of all of these attacks that I briefly mentioned in open public. We have not really given, still, from attacks that have happened since 2020, openly to the public as to what the root cause was. We've covered it quite well. So on a go-forward basis, are we having these conversations? Is that on the table?
I'd say a couple of things. First, I'm not sure if I'm disagreeing with you, but I'll style with that. And I can't comment, obviously, on any specific company or circumstance. But I would disagree in that I'm actually surprised, given how rapidly the industry and how few incidents there have been. and how secure the environment is. We would just be speculating here. But if you had hundreds, thousands of organizations maintaining their own IT infrastructure, and there would be different regimes, I would imagine that there'd be more security breaches. And there's nobody that builds a bulletproof facility like a professional data center operator or hyperscale cloud provider. Security is first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, not the top priority. And they're pretty secure. But if you had a bunch of enterprises all individually managing their own IT, I think it would be more susceptible to attack.
I also have to say two things. One, the reason there hasn't been much accountability for any of those things is because they've all hired Kemal to shield them from responsibility from any of those things. So I believe the term of art is force for sure. What could they do about it? Come on. I think the second thing is that the ones that you mentioned are the ones that are on the front pages of the paper. So there could easily be tons of breaches that you don't hear about. It's one of the issues associated with having a heavily interconnected world is those connections are online. And as a consequence of that, there's always this race between the bad actors and the good actors. And then you have things like AI that come out that accelerate both of those things. And the unfortunate reality is the bad actors are, if not as smart, sometimes smarter than the good ones, who tend to be reactive to these breaches and to the things that happen, because you need to have like a super imaginative mind to see where these breaches come from. Security from a physical perspective, from cyber perspective, and otherwise. But from a risk situation, Kemal, is that something that you are specifically conscious of in the framing of these agreements? When you're doing an agreement on behalf of an enterprise or an agreement on behalf of, say, a hyperscaler, are you focused a lot on the risk associated with a potential breach or a potential loss of the application? I know from my world that every customer, if they have 30 microseconds of downtime, claim that it costs them millions upon millions of dollars, but then they complain about a 3% escalation on a year-over-year basis. I'm kidding. I love all my customers. They're the best. They're not pains in the butts at all. But is that something you spend a lot of time on in crafting your agreements in general?
Well, like I said, security is the paramount in the business relationship itself. But I would say in terms of the amount of time we spend as a lawyer, there's a decent amount of time, but it's sort of the technical specifications and the business continuity of operations. I would say that's as more in the schedules, more between the business enterprises to the two parties to the agreement to negotiate for themselves and just figure out what's needed. And obviously, the related issue is, and we can see this a lot, and especially in some of these modern day environments where you can build a facility that's impervious to malicious actors at an incredible cost. I wouldn't call it inconvenience because you build it that way that it's by definition, but like you said, you cannot be interconnected. You cannot have content transmitted between sites, and you would have sort of a, basically for like disaster recovery type facility, you could do that at substantial cost and the service wouldn't be optimal. But that's why I say it's primarily between business enterprises, because you're like, look, here's what we need. We need to be secure, but we also need to be functional and we need to be somewhat cost effective. And then there's a balancing that goes on, but that's more on the commercial side than it is the legal side. In the legal, we have to.
Yeah, I totally concur with your statement that we have to create that balance and we have to be transparent and we have to simplify and speak the consumer language so they understand what can they do if there is an event like that happens as it pertains to security breach and whatnot. Now, the layers of complexity are getting more complicated by the day with artificial intelligence, with AGI, with brain-computer interfaces, and a plethora of other technology that's coming to the forefront. What are you seeing as to the potential future from a legal perspective that we need to be mindful of starting today and not put ourselves in a situation where we're not careful?
Just so I understand, we're careful in which respect?
Privacy, for instance, being one, to make sure that we've got the right regulation and compliance policies in place nationally and globally.
Yeah, well, I actually think the privacy and data security laws, we don't have in the U.S. a national privacy law. In Europe, there obviously is EU-wide a GDPR regime. And we even saw some new legislation in the U.S. just yesterday to try to combat different forms of malicious conduct. So I would say maybe in the U.S., it's like maybe more of, instead of having pockets of different regimes, having more of a national framework might help matters on the privacy and data security front, more similar to sort of where EU GDPR.
Do you think any of that regulation or compliance or legal is potentially going to stall the innovation, especially at the pace that we're moving?
Well, it's funny you said that because I would go slightly the opposite. One of the problems with legislation is, I talked about the Telecom Act of 1996, but since Phil's business started in 1996, one of the fun facts you used to say in 1996 about Telecom Act, after it had been more than 60 years since there had been any meaningful legislation in the space. And then finally, there was new legislation in 1996, and it was outdated the day it was enacted. And it was legislating against old technologies and anachronistic sort of technologies and solving yesterday's problems. And that's not to be disrespectful. It's an act that launched many of our careers. And it's just to say that technology moves much, much faster than any legislative or regulatory process. I guess it is fair to say it's not that regulation stifles innovation. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I would say that they adopt regulation and it's anachronistic immediately. And by the time it's adopted, you're literally regulating things that occurred 2 or 3 years ago and not today's problems. And then that does have a little bit of a drag on new technology. They're like, listen, we're trying to move into this next generation of technology against the regulatory regime that really doesn't apply. So there could be inconsistencies. And we saw that in the world of telecom as well, when there was a telecom regulation gentle drag on internet, in which did apply, did not apply. There was many, many battles fought over that.
As a consequence of that, is your feeling that there is no place for regulation in the world of AI and how it's implemented and leveraged for the same reason, that the legislators are always going to be miles behind how the technology has evolved? So what's the point?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say
I'm really putting this political science degree to the fucking test.
so we're it goes back. We'll finish the 1996 point. It's sort of like the 1996 Act had different regulatory regimes for voice and internet, and then the next day there's voice over the internet, and then it was a decade worth of battles. Was it should it be regulated as voice or should it be regulated as internet? And that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. So I would say legislation, and this is not my area, but I would say focusing more on broad principles as opposed to trying to regulate specific technologies or specific practices, because I just don't see, literally, when I look at my own practice, what I'm doing today, if our clients, is dramatically different than what I was doing even 6 months ago. The legislative and regulatory process takes years before rules are enacted, 2, 3, 5 years before it's enacted. So by the time you get a rule, so I would say stick with broad principles and objectives and more trying to regulate specific practices or technology.
Presumably that assumes that we as a country can agree on a set of principles that make sense. And that's a different podcast for a different day. So you have a couple of main areas of practice that you alluded to earlier. You have digital data centers, and you have kind of tower, wireline, and wireless. And then you have this kind of subsea cabling, kind of contracts that you work on and transactions that you work on. Of those three, is there something particularly interesting or unique about one versus the other? I'm thinking like it's hard for me to even fathom from a subsea cabling perspective, the various interests and counterparties, international waters and otherwise, et cetera, that you put into a contract, and whether that's even something that you worry about, or you just assume that everything in the middle of the ocean is fine. But there's some interesting things between those that you could cite that would be out, like people would not assume.
Yeah, and I'll answer the question a little bit different. If this is something I talk about all the time, I have a little speech.
Oh, I've pulled the string.
Yeah.
Okay. Get ready, everyone. Grab the popcorn.
There's no such thing as a data center, and there's no such thing as terrestrial fiber, and there's no such thing as a tower or PDUs or GPUs or submarine cables. It's just one thing, the global communications ecosystem. Now, different players play in individual component parts of it. Tower operators build tower, data center operators build data centers, but a data center is built in the middle of nowhere without energy feeds and power and fiber and content and servers.
What's fascinating to me is that there is this entire basis of law. Like, you can talk about certain things of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 and various elements of legislation, but the same legal principles that were established at the dawn of our country are the ones that kind of your generation of lawyers have had to apply to this like kind of technical, nuanced ecosystem that you've applied it to. So how have you done that? Like, how have you kind of adopted legal language to talk about things like subsea cablings and different elements of the ecosystem and the different nuances of digital infrastructure in a way that makes sense to presumably Judge Judy that you have to bring these things in front of? Because presumably, I've always been a fan of the idea that, you know, a contract is something that you put in place just so you can stick it in a drawer. And if you pull it out, you've already lost. But presumably these things are going to be argued in front of people that have no basis of knowledge. They're going to be judged by people that have these little hammers, like I brought one, these little hammers that have no basis of knowledge or foundational knowledge or the curiosity and the historical perspective that you have. So how do you apply like traditional legalese to this incredibly technical ecosystem that is all the same thing?
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I'll answer it simply because there's another thing I talk about a lot and I'll stick with data centers. So I always say, this is going back many, many years ago, but my skill as a lawyer grew exponentially in 24 hours. It was maybe 20 years ago. It was when I first visited a data center. And I had been talking again with words on paper and contracts for several years before that, somewhat theoretically. But then when you actually take a detailed engineering level tour of a data center, and you're like, that really does need to go from there to there. And that sort of goes to the industry expertise that I was talking about. It applies across all aspects of digital infrastructure, where when you have a deep understanding of the technology, the competitive landscape, and the overall environment in which your clients operate, it's much more than words. When you get to a section, you're not drafting generic language, you're drafting language that says, hey, this is what the client needs. And time again, we've seen that has reaped benefits because the contract goes in a drawer, never to be looked at again, unless there's a dispute or an issue or a challenge or something. And so 2 years later, you go in that drawer, you foresaw this, you anticipated it based on what we need.
Based on experience, we've spent a fair amount of time at conferences talking about where we were heading as a sector and what the future beholds. There is a lot of discussions around artificial intelligence. We've really started to see the spike of where the market is over the last couple of years, and it's just growing bonkers, right? So the question that I have is, as far as AI growing the footprint of the data infrastructure is concerned, for starters, are we building fast enough? Are we building smart enough? And how do we address the power challenges that we have as of today with the limited infrastructure capacity that we have, the fact that we have not updated the distribution centers or power distribution over the last 2-3 decades, knowing might as well that 45.3 gigawatts was the total compute power last year. And by 2030, we are estimating to be about 130, 140 gigawatts. Where is that going to come from? We've got nuclear stuck in legislation. We can't get it through the system for the next 5 to 7 years. Other options, such as hydrogen, are limited in resources and distribution channels. So how do we address that on a go-forward basis? Not necessarily from an engineering perspective, but from a legal perspective.
Yeah. So from a legal perspective, we're seeing a lot of sort of strategic alliances between powered land providers and data center operators, along with tenants. We're seeing power suppliers, along with data center operators, doing behind the meter type solutions. You have alternative energy, which is critical. We're seeing the gas generation trying to be used, which traditionally has been used as an interim power solution. You can use more comprehensively on some much longer bridge until, and of course, nuclear is widely discussed, but not widely implemented, because it's still several years out before we're at all when we see widespread implementation of nuclear power to data center. It's all of the above approach. From a legal perspective, the best we can do, you have the power availability challenges, you have the global supply chain challenges. We spent a lot of time talking about power availability, but supply chain, we hear 24 to 36 months on electrical transformers and 18 to 36 months on GPUs and PDUs and UPS.
I think the last thing I heard was 72 months on a gas turbine.
It's a 72 months. I got a new number here. I can start to throw out. And so from a legal perspective, the best we can do, and that's sort of our approach to contracting as well, is like, listen, the reason we're all here at the table when you're doing a deal is you want to do business together. But against the backdrop of those challenges, we're not trying to play hide the ball. We say, listen, we got some real power challenges. We got some real supply chain challenges. And so our delivery schedule with commitments that we can make are all being made against the backdrop of this very challenging environment. And it's really important that you take the time to account for the operational realities on the ground, as opposed to, from sales perspective, signing up the big contract as quickly as possible and hoping that you're able to make the commitments, because a lot of it's outside of your control.
Does anything give you pause about like the just explosive growth of the moment? You've been through the ebbs and flows. Does this feel like one of those like pre-popped bubbles? Are you seeing like you are contracting for things, you are lawyering on things that are years and years out, as opposed to things that are anticipated to be deployed in the immediate term? Does any of that give you pause? Are you conscious of how crazy things are, or is it just going to continue to go up until we are fishing for natural resources on an asteroid somewhere to try to account for the type of power demand that we need?
Well, I'll answer the bubble question. Well, I'll respond to the bubble question, because it's a question that's been getting asked a lot now. And
I thought I was so unique.
not in this instance, in many other ways.
It was the asteroid, Phil.
But I think it's actually pretty important. I've been around a while. I've been practicing 30 years. I've been around much longer. But when you look over the last 30, 40, 50 years at the bubbles, what would be called a bubble, what you find, this is just me talking, I don't have a study on it or anything, is that the use of the term bubble can be really misplaced, because in the 80s, we had the S&L crisis, where there was a bubble that burst in the world of banking. And that was a result of a variety of financial practices, but the fundamental underpinnings of the banking system was, and the strength was never in question.
For our younger listeners, that's savings and loan, not Saturday Night Live.
That's right. And we talk about the tech bubble bursting. Well, the tech bubble certainly did burst, and there was a real tough on the global economy, and there were some bad bets made. But technology not only continued to grow and proliferate, but it's fundamentally the backbone of the global economy now. You look at the Great Recession, which was fundamentally a recession related to real estate financing, but there's very little doubt we need more housing. We need real estate. It continues to be a central part of, and will always be a part of the global economy. So what you're really talking, when I hear bubble, is digital infrastructure. This goes to the point of, is it going anywhere? Not a chance. There's no chance that this is a bubble and that this is a industry that is going to see a meaningful decline. We're only going to see dramatic growth. But if you mean bubble, are there going to be some bad bets made? Maybe a lot of bad bets, because this is what happens when you're in the precipice of a new rollout of a new global technology. Nobody wants to miss out on the latest AI technology. And I do think you'll see some bad bets, maybe a lot of bad bets, but you're also, for every bad bet, you're going to see the emergence, just like we did in the social media context, that when the tech bubble burst, there's a Facebook that emerges or a Google that emerges, for every tech company, not for everyone, but you get the point, is that there's some...
Are you suggesting you no longer have a MySpace account?
The young people at home, I don't even remember that.
All right, let's switch subjects real quick. So we talk about human capital deficit. We've got to fill about 1.6 million jobs or so by 2030. We've got a major talent gap, a shortage thereof. What kind of people we know from a physical layer and engineering and so on and so forth? Do you think there is that need within the legal system, whether it be representation or whatever else the attorneys do? Do we need people with that skill set?
Yeah, that's why I think what you guys are doing is a good thing. It's no secret that whether it be STEM or other, our educational system could really use, if there's a boost, it would be in science and technology area, because nobody really grows up thinking, hey, I want to be in digital infrastructure. And it goes to the beginning of what we're talking about. That's sort of an industry that you learn, oh, wow, unlike healthcare, people do say, I want to grow up and be a doctor or a nurse. Nobody says, I want to grow up and be digital infrastructure. I think if we educated people a little earlier on the tremendous opportunities in technology, I think we would have a much broader swath of participants, and particularly participants among underserved and minorities and women can move or are underrepresented in the industry. And I think that would be a big push there. And I think that would help alleviate the problem, as we're not seeing any end in sight for the opportunities.
I think Kemal Hawa is ready to be a Nomad Futurist ambassador. I hear the pitch.
Well, that was a pitch. Kemal, I know we are pressing on time over here. Just two last questions before we're going to let you go. If you weren't doing what you're doing today, what would you be doing?
I wanted to be a high school teacher.
Well, you made a good career choice. One piece of advice that you would give the younger generation and or people that are not exposed to the data infrastructure sector that you would like to give them to potentially entertain the idea of coming to our space?
About what's attractive about the space? I guess for that, I would have to go back to my previous answer and say, listen, in the next 50 years, almost a zero chance that there'll be any material decline. It could be periods of stagnation. Listen, we talked about other, who knows, but our devices, our need for content is not going anywhere. And in fact, it's just going to continue to proliferate. You can do worse than a lot worse than picking a segment of the economy that not only today the backbone of the global economy, but there's literally no one projecting or predicting a decline. And we're looking out 50 years and wondering how we're going to meet the demand over the next 50 years. So I would say if you're looking for stability and an area that's of the economy that's central, then this is it.
You can either be disrupted by AI or you can provide the foundational for its inevitable growth. Thank you so much, Kemal.
Thank you.
Pleasure having you as always. And I will say, to end this thing, as I've always wanted to say, case dismissed.
Thank you for joining us on the Nomad Futurist podcast. Remember, technology, markets, and challenges will continue to evolve, but those who adapt and prepare are the ones who will thrive. Embrace the change, stay curious, and let's build a future worth moving towards. The journey has just begun, and we're glad you're here with us. Visit us anytime at media.nomadfuturist.org to stay connected and be a part of the movement. Until next time, keep exploring.